who was less than 6 feet from the president on his motorcycle, was later quoted as saying, quote, "His head exploded in blood." Also witnessing the third and final shot were Bill and Gail Newman. And here's a picture of them, and when you watch the footage, you can see them very clearly. Bill and Gail Newman, who were both 22 years old, had their 2 young boys with them, and they were standing on the curb on the north side of Elm Street when they became witnesses to one of the most horrific events in American history. Immediately after the third shot, the Newmans fell to the ground, shielding their children. And you can see them very clear in any of the footage that you see of the Kennedy assassination from whatever angle. They are among the most recognizable eyewitnesses to the shooting, as they appear in many of the iconic photos taken during the tragic time in our nation's history. Now, after the third shot, 2 things of significance happened. Agent Clint Hill immediately turned and gave a thumbs down to the Secret Service vehicle, letting them know the third shot was bad in view of life for President Kennedy. He was on the running board on this side over here when he saw the third shot. He saw everything. And he turned and gave a thumbs down to the rest of the Secret Service, basically telling them that it was not bad, it was not good in view of life for the president. Second thing that happened after the third shot is Jackie began to climb out of the back of the limousine. And you'll see that on footage. And she had climbed on the top of the limousine to retrieve a piece of the president's skull, which had landed on the back deck of the automobile. Well, Mrs. Kennedy was met by Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who had leaped onto the back of the car and pushed her down back into the car. And if you watch on the film, which I'll show you, Agent Hill nearly fell from the limousine several times, and if he'd have fallen down, without question, he'd have been run over by the Secret Service vehicle that was behind him. And you can see him struggling to get on the presidential limousine. Well, Hill then provided a human shield for the Kennedys as the limousine began a race to nearby Parkland Hospital, which was 77 blocks away, about 4.6 miles from Elm Street. Now, Mrs. Kennedy was later quoted as saying about this whole incident, quote, "I heard these terrible noises, and my husband never made a sound. He had this sort of quizzical look on his face. I remember thinking he just looked as if he had a slight headache." I think she was talking about the first shot. "I remember falling on him and saying, 'Oh my God, they have shot my husband. And I love you, Jack. I remember I was shouting.'" Agent Clint Hill was later quoted as saying, "I heard a noise. I saw President Kennedy grab at himself and lurch forward. Mrs. Kennedy jumped from the seat. When she noticed that I was trying to climb on the car, she turned toward me and I grabbed her and put her back in the back seat and lay there." Governor Connolly, also hit in the shooting, was later quoted as saying, "Strangely, I had but one thought. This is an assassination attempt. When I was hit, I said, 'Oh, no, no, no.' And then I said, 'My God, they're going to kill us all.'" Kennedy aide Kenneth O'Donnell, who was traveling in the Secret Service car immediately behind the presidential limousine, later wrote down, "After the second shot, David Powers said to me, 'Kenny, I think the president's been shot.' I made a quick sign of the cross. While we both stared at the president, a third shot took the side of his head off. We saw pieces of bone and brain tissue and bits of reddish hair flying through the air. The impact lifted him and shook him limply as if he were a rag doll, and then he dropped out of our sight, sprawled against the back seat of the car." Secret Service agent Rufus Youngblood, who was assigned to President Johnson, who was in the car behind the Secret Service vehicle, was later quoted as saying, "I turned instinctively in my seat, and with my left hand I grasped Lyndon Johnson's right shoulder, and with all the leverage I could exert from a sitting position, I forced him downward. 'Get down,' I shouted, 'get down.' The Vice President reacted immediately. Still not seeing the source of the explosion, I swung across the back seat and sat on top of him," because he didn't see what everybody else had seen. Also present on Elm Street at the time of the shooting was a lady by the name of Mary Ann Mormon and her friend Jean Hill, who became famously known as the Lady in Red. And again, here's a picture of myself and Jean Hill, and a picture of her and Mary Mormon. And we'll get to this, but these are these two ladies, and they were in Daly Plaza across the street from the grassy knoll watching the president. Miss Mormon had her Polaroid camera and was going to take photos for her son so he wouldn't have to miss school the day President Kennedy visited Dallas. And as the shots were fired, Mormon took a photo at the exact moment President Kennedy was hit with the first bullet. Mormon also witnessed the third and fatal shot, later stating to reporters, "I heard Jackie yell, 'My God, he's been shot.' I saw his hair jump, but it wasn't just his hair, it was part of his head." So Mary Ann Mormon's probably standing from me to Hannah, from the president, when he's shot. Probably that far. Because if you go to Daly Plaza and you get into this area, it looks like on video it's a huge area. It's actually very small. And anyone in Daly Plaza would have had a bird's eye view of whatever went on. Now, this is the photograph that Mary Ann Mormon took right here from behind. And she took it with this, not this exact camera, but this camera here is the camera that she was using when she took this photograph. So I'll just kind of pass this. And this is the photograph she got, one of the few photographs from the opposite side of where the president was on the grassy knoll. Okay, so we'll save that, put that right there. But that's the exact camera she was using for that photograph.
It's a Polaroid land camera?
You know, I had to look like crazy to find these things.
I think it's a Polaroid.
I think it is a Polaroid land. Yeah, and it folds down. I mean, I'm not kidding you. I had to look all over to find this thing. But this is the exact camera. I'll just let you look at it. This was the exact camera that Mary Mormon used to take that picture that I'm passing around there.
So which window is it? Which window is it? The sixth?
Sixth floor, yep.
In the
Sixth
corner?
floor in the corner, yep.
Right-hand corner?
Yep.
That's a Bellows camera.
Now, we'll kind of go from there, just give you some thoughts, but as the presidential motorcade sped to Parkland Hospital, at 12:33 p.m., the telephone rang in the emergency room at Parkland. And the telephone was answered by a registered nurse by the name of Doris Nelson, who was later quoted as saying this: "The operator told me the president had been shot. I thought she was joking and asked her, 'Well, what else is new?' But then, from the tone of her voice, I knew she wasn't kidding. She said the president's motorcade was on its way to Parkland." Well, at 11:34 p.m., the UPI, or United Press International, transmitted a 12-word bulletin that went around the world. It said, quote, "3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas." Again, those 12 words came out around the world on the UPI teletype. Now, if you want to know what a teletype is, if you look at that picture back there that has the papers and a picture of President Kennedy with the American flag and then in the limousine, those are teletypes that came over on the Miles City Star in Miles City, Montana on that exact day. Now, the UPI was receiving this information directly from UPI White House correspondent Merriman Smith. He was riding in the 5th car behind the president's limousine, directly in front of the car's only radio telephone. So after the shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade, Smith got on that radio and he reported back to the UPI the following. He said, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. Some of the Secret Service agents thought the gunfire was from an automatic weapon fired to the right rear of the president's car, probably from a grassy knoll to which police rushed. And as a result, Merriman Smith was the person who originally made the term grassy knoll. And here he is right here. I got some good stuff. So Merriman Smith is one that coined the phrase grassy knoll from his report that he gave to UPI on the scene. Well, at 12, this is an unbelievable story. At 12:34 p.m., there were several members of President Kennedy's cabinet that were actually on their way to a trading conference in Tokyo, Japan. And this trading conference had the following individuals. Had Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Treasury Secretary C. Douglas Dillon and Press Secretary Pierre Salinger were all on this airplane heading to a trading conference in Tokyo. Well, also present on the airplane was the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, Robert Manning. Now, there's a reason why I tell you about such a guy that you've never heard of. Well, the UPI bulletin comes across the teletype on that airplane as well, that 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. Well, the man that retrieved that teletype message off of the machine and handed it to Secretary of State Dean Rusk was Robert Manning. Now, I'm going to stop and tell you a story there, and I got to find this. I mean, this is how life is. So I don't even know that story, right? I got to find this book. I don't even know that story about Robert Manning. I don't have one clue who Robert Manning is. I know that somebody ripped that thing off the teletype and gave it to Dean Rusk. So I'm sitting in my classroom one day in Roberts, Montana, quite a few years ago, and Prior Pearson's father, who's an elementary kid, comes in, and he never really came to school much. He was an outfitter, really a nice guy. And he looked in my window and he said, and he had a guy with him. And he was an outfitter, and I said, "Come on in, Pat." And he says, "Well, no, you come here." He's kind of shy. And I came out there, he says, "Hey, I want to introduce you to this guy. He's here fishing. I'm taking you out fishing." And he said, "I think you'd be interested in meeting him." And I said, "What's his name?" And he said, "His name is Robert Manning." And I didn't know anything about Robert Manning. I says, "Well, come on in." Well, then he tells the story about this to my kids, that he was on the airplane. So he ended up writing a book called The Swamp Root Chronicle, which I'll be honest with you, I've never read, because it has to do with adventures, world trade. Well, there's the picture of he and I in Roberts, after I gave him a Roberts t-shirt, and then he signed the book for me here. And that's the Robert Manning that we are talking about that tore the teletype off that machine. I don't know how things like that happen, but they do. Well, once those cabinet members were aware of the happenings in Dallas, Press Secretary Salinger got on a radio and spoke directly to the Situation Room in the White House. So they are corresponding directly from the airplane going to Tokyo and the White House. And Salinger's statements to the people in the Situation Room at the White House were as follows. He said, "Please listen hard. This plane on which Secretary of State Rusk and other cabinet members are headed for Japan is turning around and returning to Honolulu. Will arrive there in approximately 2 hours. Any other information, please get as quickly as possible." So what information are they wanting to know?
Status of the
The
president.
status of the president. So for the next 30 minutes, keep this in mind, for the next 30 minutes on that airplane speaker system was nothing but silence. Suddenly at about 1 o'clock, a voice came over the speaker system on the airplane from the White House Situation Room that stated, "Wayside, stand by." 30 seconds later, "Wayside, stand by." 30 seconds later, "Wayside, stand by." That took place for a period of several minutes during that time. We'll get back to that. Well, then we get on to the famous Zapruder film. And there were many, many people that were filming the motorcade that day in downtown Dallas. However, the only full recording of the assassination was filmed by Abraham Zapruder, who was a dress manufacturer in Dallas. And the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Zapruder had arrived at his place of business at the Dow Tex building in downtown Dallas. Now that was positioned directly across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. That's where he worked. Well, when Zapruder arrived at work that morning, he did not have his 8mm Bell & Howell movie camera with him. And his assistant, Marilyn Sitzman, convinced him to go home and get his camera so he could film the event, so he could later show his children and grandchildren. He didn't even show up with the camera when he first got there. And she talked him into going back home. Well, he took her advice and went and got his camera. I just happened to have one. If I can get it out of here. This is not the camera, obviously, but the exact camera that Abraham Zapruder was using to film his film.
Now, does that use the 8mm cartridge of film, or does it, you have to wind the two reels?
You have to wind it. Matter of fact,
No, I mean the actual film, does it come on a reel, or does
Yeah.
it come in a cartridge? Yeah, okay, yeah, so it's gotta come in a reel.
yeah, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too, but get the damn thing closed now. Okay, there you go. But that's what he filmed with. Okay? Well, anyway, to continue the story, when he got back to his place of employment, he asked Marilyn Sitzman to go with him to Daley Plaza to see the President and the First Lady. He wanted her to go with him. Well, in Daley Plaza, Zapruder positioned himself on the top of a 4-foot concrete block on the grassy knoll. Blake Kroger and I have been on it. The position overlooked Daley Plaza towards Elm Street, where the President's motorcade would travel on its way to the Stemmons Freeway entrance. And the reason he wanted Sitzman to go is he suffered from vertigo, and he would get dizzy on elevated ground. So Marilyn Sitzman actually stood on the pillar with him and held him so he would not fall over while he was filming this film. Well, as the President's limousine approached him, Abraham Zapruder filmed the entire assassination. Would you like to see it? Have you ever seen it? How many people have not seen it? Oh, really? Well, you'll see it. And this is great. It's gross, but it goes in slow motion and everything else, so you'll get an idea.
Yeah.
Are those streets still like that?
They're exactly like that, yeah. They're exactly like that. Haven't changed an iota. All right. We'll watch a little video. Get tired of listening to me talk, we'll watch a little video. I got lots of them for you. I don't know how many we'll get through tonight, but Hannah, my dear, would you mind getting those lights? Thank you. We'll leave the door, will be okay. Okay, here we go. This is what he filmed.
This is the first of the digital versions and is shown without the images between the sprocket holes. The framing is the standard format.
Okay, these are the sprocket holes that you saw inside that camera where it wound up. Now, this is the turn right here. This is the turn on Elm. Okay, from Houston on to Elm. This is where they slowed down to 11 miles an hour right here. Okay? I'm going to let it run, then I'll point out quite a few things here. Watch it the first time. See Jackie going back? Happened that quick, 6 seconds, start to finish.
This is a replay of the standard format version, this time in slow motion.
Okay, now this is slow motion. Now, there's a sign here that I want you to see that really impedes a lot of what happened here. Because if you see this sign right here, it'll be when the first shot actually was fired as the President was behind the sign. Right here he's waving. See him waving? Now when he goes behind the sign, he's going to be fine till he gets behind the sign. When he gets out of the sign, you're going to see that he's hit. Boom. Both hands heading up to his throat. Both hands at his throat. The question is, has Connolly been hit yet or not? Okay, it's hard to say. You know what this is right here? That's his hand. What's in his hand? What's this in his hand? His Stetson cowboy hat. So if that bullet had hit his right wrist and shattered his radius, would he be holding that hat? I don't know. But that's hard to say. But you can obviously see the president's hit right here. Now you can see Connolly's hit. You see him here? He's fallen back into Nellie's lap. Mrs. Kennedy's got her head 4 inches from the president's at this point. And there she goes back for the piece of skull, and there's Clint Hill climbing on the back of the limousine. It's kind of gross, I apologize, but at least you're not 4th period before lunch.
The images between the sprocket holes could only be seen on slides of the original film. This is the first time that those images can be seen as part of a motion sequence.
See, they're showing you what's over here now.
Frame numbers are also displayed for research purposes.
And again, this will just show you what happened between the sprocket holes, which at this time is the first time that had ever been seen. But again, you'll see the same thing, and then we'll let it go and then talk some more in a minute. But this is kind of live. This is what Zapruder saw in his eye finder. Can you imagine that?
So he was on the car behind
Who's?
Clint?
Yes.
This is a replay with the images between the sprocket holes, this time in slow motion.
You'll see Jean Hill, the lady in red, and Mary Mormon. If you pay attention, they're going to be across the Elm Street, and you'll see them clearly in this picture as the motorcade goes by during the assassination. And it'll give you an idea how close they actually were to the limousine.